So we've been talking about how we define species and how those species are maintained. But we also want to talk about like how speciation actually happens, so what causes it. And so for the formation of a new species to occur, we need lots of genetic changes to accumulate. And so we need lots of genetic changes that eventually contribute to the differences, like the ability to interbreed or the physical appearances that we judge to create a new species. So this is, again, kind of from the human lens. And so what leads to those genetic changes? So what's going to cause those genetic changes? Microevolution. Okay, so speciation is macroevolution, but microevolution is contributing these genetic changes that eventually lead to speciation. So microevolution, and so just to remind you, things that are microevolutionary forces include new mutations, natural selection, genetic drift, migration, and non-random mating. So all of these are potential ways that organisms are acquiring these genetic changes that eventually lead to new species. So how fast does speciation occur? So that really depends on, first of all, whether you're talking about geologic time or generation time. So my first point is that geologic time, which is what we measure in years and days and hours, our sort of standard time, is this fixed thing. But generation time depends on the organism. So generation time is how long it takes to go from one generation to the next generation to another generation. So this might be the grandparents, the parents, the children. This is highly dependent on an organism. So in humans, this time period is more like 20 years. We're slow reproducers. It takes a long time for us to reach maturity and to have offspring. But for bacteria, generation time is only a matter of hours. So for them, speciation might occur faster in geologic time, but that's because they reproduce much faster. It still takes a lot of generations in order for speciation to occur. The other point here is the difference between two ideas, gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. So one idea for how speciation occurs is that you get gradual changes over time. So instead of going from light brown to white all at once, the mouse is evolving and accumulating small genetic changes that eventually produce the white mouse. So first it's a lighter mouse, then an even lighter mouse, then finally the white mouse. Or the other direction is it's going to become a darker, slightly darker mouse, and then eventually a very dark mouse. So accumulating lots of little genetic changes that eventually cause big differences. That's gradualism. The other competing idea is that there's punctuated equilibrium, which is that organisms can be unchanged for a really long time. That's the equilibrium period. So here's the mouse staying the same color. And then that unchanged period is sometimes broken up by very sudden, fast change. And this would be initiated by, for example, a dramatic mutation that causes the mouse to suddenly be white. So it didn't gradually become white, it suddenly became white due to a sudden mutation. And then that white mouse might be unchanged for a long period of time. Or it might be that there's a sudden mutation that causes a dark mouse, and then that dark mouse would be unchanged for a long period of time. So which is right, gradualism or punctuated equilibrium? Well, it really just depends. We think both are probably true, depending on the context and what's happening in the organism. So sometimes a trait is being influenced by gradualism, sometimes it's punctuated equilibrium. So when we look at speciation over the arc of time, we see it take two different forms. We're going to focus on Claddagh Genesis. Claddagh Genesis is when you have an ancestral species that diverges into 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different new species. So claddo means to split, right? So Claddagh Genesis is when we're splitting into multiple new species. And this is how over Earth's history we went from having a small number of species, the earliest forms of life, to millions and millions of species, is because one species would give rise to two or more. So we see Claddagh Genesis a lot in the evolution of species on life on Earth. In order for Claddagh Genesis to occur, something had to happen to this ancestor that stimulated it to become two new species, or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 new species. And so this is some kind of initiating factor that splits it into different species. And this involves the block of gene flow. So in other words, we're saying we have a population, that's the ancestral population. Something's going to split this population into different groups, and that's the gene flow blockage. What blocks that gene flow is categorized in 2 different ways, either allopatric speciation or sympatric speciation. So again, these are different ways that the gene flow will be blocked. And that will lead to different species forming from one ancestor species.